For years, critics called Jacob's Ladder a Vietnam fever dream about PTSD. Here's the twist. The monsters aren't really demons at all. They're angels in disguise. The nightmare imagery, the time-shifting narrative, it's all part of a spiritual design meant to guide Jacob, and us, towards spiritual enlightenment and letting go. From the title's biblical allusions to Louis the chiropractor quoting Meister Eckhart, this isn't just a story about a veteran losing his mind. It's an initiation, a step-by-step passage through purgatory disguised as a horror movie. And once you see that pattern, the entire film flips from a story of terror into a roadmap for transcendence. But how does the Vietnam fever dream become a map for the dying? That's the puzzle set up by Bruce Joel Rubin, a screenwriter shaped by Eastern philosophy and a formative LSD experience. Jacob's Ladder was never about horror for Rubin. From its very title, the film signals something about ascendance and transformation. In Genesis, Jacob dreams of a stairway connecting earth to heaven, with angels moving between the two realms. This imagery endures because it represents more than spectacle. It's a vision of transition between mortality and the divine. That's what the names Jacob's Ladder plants in your mind before a single frame rolls. You're being told this is a story about crossing over, not just a tale of trauma. Yet, throughout the early 1990s, it was easier for critics and audiences to place the movie in a safer category. A psychological horror film built around PTSD, paranoia, and drug experiments. That interpretation fit the cultural moment, but it also flattened the bigger structure hiding in plain sight. The filmmakers themselves pointed to a different foundation. In its earliest drafts, the movie wasn't even called Jacob's Ladder, but instead Dante's Inferno. That's a title that leaves no doubt that you're on a journey through hell's stages towards release. Swapping Dante for Jacob doesn't erase that. It joins biblical ascent and medieval descent, binding together two major traditions of afterlife storytelling. The evidence isn't limited to what the script was first called. The film itself underlines its spiritual frame with persistent detail. Just look inside Jacob Singer's Bronx apartment and your eyes land on overt markers of devotion. There's a copy of Dante's Divine Comedy, the cross, and so on. These are not random set decorations. They tell you what world Jacob lives in and what inner journey he's already prepared to face. This framework extends into his relationships. His youngest son, who died before the events of the story, is named Gabe. That abbreviation is not neutral. It refers to Gabriel, the messenger angel who bridges earth and heaven. By the time Gabe reappears in the film's final vision, the connection is unmistakable. He is a guide meant to lead Jacob upward. And on the other side, there's Jezebel, the name carried by his girlfriend. Biblical shorthand paints Jezebel as an emblem of temptation and false devotion, luring people away from the path of truth. These name choices map Jacob's struggle, closing off the idea that the movie is about chemical hallucinations alone. They mark the opposing pools between attachment and release. Once you accept that deeper meaning, the film's design shifts. What once looked like random grotesquerie falls into the pattern of faith. The edits, the visions, and the hospital corridors all serve less as metaphors for shell shock than as dramatizations of a man wavering between two worlds. Critics who limited the interpretation to military experiments or psychiatric collapse sat with half the puzzle, but they missed the film's deeper meaning. Remove the genre trappings, and Jacob's Ladder plays like a late 20th century parable about purgatory, staged through the lens of Vietnam and American distrust of institutions. But there's still one element left unexplained. If the title and symbols make clear this was never just about horror, then what do we make of the terrifying beings Jacob sees? The shaking faces, the hospital monsters, the figures that seem bent on pulling him down. The film itself gives the answer in one quiet conversation, a single line that flips the entire reading of those creatures. And once you hear it, their role comes into focus in a way that changes pretty much everything. What looks like horror begins shifting when you listen closely to what the film tells you. The question is not whether Jacob sees demons, but whether those figures are demons at all. And the answer to that question comes from the most mundane of places, a visit to his chiropractor. Louis, the wry caregiver, played by Danny Aiello, pauses and offers Jacob a piece of philosophy taken directly from Meister Eckhart. He says,
"If you're frightened of dying and you're holding on, you'll see devils tearing your life away. But if you've made your peace, then the devils are really angels, freeing you from the earth."
This is not a vague metaphor inserted for color. The script is quoting Eckhart almost word for word. Louis functions as a translator, clearing up misconceptions about every grotesque vision we've seen thus far. Audiences in 1990 rarely stopped to weigh that line. Most read Jacob's apparitions as creatures of trauma, tied to his wartime injuries or some shadowy drug experiment. His infamous hospital sequence, the gurneys whipping past, restraints binding him while faceless attendants prod him under flickering light, was taken as a visualization of post-traumatic stress. The surface was horrifying enough that the explicit philosophical cue vanished under the noise. Louis' line became background static, while the monsters were filed away as symbols of psychological collapse. And yet, the design of those monsters points to something more deliberate. Director Adrian Lyne himself said he drew on the imagery of Francis Bacon when constructing Jacob's visions.
So, using imagery of, say, Francis Bacon, because of the blurred kind of imagery that he uses, where you can't quite see what's going on, because there's movement in it, and you get a sense that there's something quite ghastly going on in that shadow, you know what I'm saying?
The hospital detritus in Jacob's Nightmare feels directly inspired by that aesthetic. When read alongside Louis' words, the Bacon influence makes sense. These figures are sculptors, tearing away what Jacob still clings to. The film even stages specific images as if they were religious allegories. In one scene, neighbors submerge Jacob in a bathtub filled with ice. As scholars have noted, the composition mirrors traditional paintings of Christ's descent from the cross. Jacob's limp body lowered by attendants who appear both menacing and tender. In another moment, while Jacob lies strapped in the hospital, a surgical lamp swings into place above him. For a brief instant, it glows like a halo, spotlighting his face as if sanctifying rather than torturing him. These aren't accidents of lighting or staging. They visually insist that the supposed demons accompany him through a sacred passage. Consider Jacob's responses. When he fights against his captors and insists on holding on to his old life, the figures twist into sharper horrors. Their movements accelerate, their faces grow grotesque. But in repeated moments, when he stops resisting, when he calms or yields to memory, the intensity of the vision softens too. These are subtle reminders that when Jacob releases his attachments, he alters the face of what pursues him. Read this way, the images long treated as terrifying punishments become reframed as guides. They don't drag Jacob downward, they're trying to lift him up. Hellfire, as Eckhart described, is nothing more than the burning of what refuses to yield. In that frame, Jacob's writhing visions are the necessary flame. Not punishment, but purification. The film's most frightening moments, then, hide a paradox. Angels costumed as monsters. Lyne stages them through Bacon-inspired distortion and religious tableau. Rubin's script makes clear they are in the service of release. Jacob Singer's demons are less projections of madness than disguises for the forces of transition, just prodding him to let go. And once you see them that way, a larger question rises. If Jacob's supposed demons are really angels concealed in horror's clothing, then why does his path echo not only Christian mysticism, but something that feels closer to another tradition altogether? One that also mapped the stages of death and insisted on recognizing terrifying figures as guides. Rubin was very interested in Eastern religion, and in Tibetan tradition, there is a funerary text known as the Bardo Thodol, or the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It is not written as a riddle for monks, but as a manual for the dying, recited aloud to guide consciousness through the bardo, the intermediate state between one life and the next. These passages describe bewildering landscapes, terrifying beings, and fleeting worlds where perception falters. The text's central instruction is clear. Every frightening form is only a projection of the mind. Liberation comes by recognizing their illusory nature. In Jacob's Ladder, the places Jacob wanders, the vacant streets, the grim hospital wings, and the shadowed stairwells, function like these bardo states. They feel half-real, designed to trap him until he sees through them. That symmetry exists because screenwriter Bruce Joel Rubin intentionally drew from Eastern traditions.
The great moment of the ending, when you realize he just died on an operating table in Vietnam, is the realization that the whole movie was a journey through his brain, through his mind. It was the journey of the bardo, the last stages of his mind and any human mind that is dying.
When he wrote Jacob's Ladder, he used the suspense framework not purely for fright, but as what he called an initiation text hidden in a studio film. These parallels come into sharper focus when you connect the bardo's key teaching with what the film declares outright. The Tibetan Book of the Dead insists that terrifying figures are projections that transform once recognized. In the film, Louis frames it through Meister Eckhart. If you resist, you see devils, but if you accept, they reveal themselves as angels freeing you. Rubin is not asking you to choose between Christianity or Buddhism. He's staging a conversation between them, suggesting that both traditions point to the same truth. Liberation begins the moment you stop clinging. This framework explains Jacob's torments more deeply than just PTSD alone. He clings to his lost son Gabe, unable to forgive himself. He drags the wreckage of a ruined marriage and his fallen soldier identity, refusing to accept their end. In Jacob's visions, every memory resurfaces as a trap. Grief for Gabe, longing for family, guilt for Vietnam. Each binding becomes another horror staged around him, and each horror only persists as long as his grip remains tight. Formally, the film enacts this confusion through its craft. Editor Tom Rolfe's use of abrupt jump cuts, sudden smash transitions, and disorienting match frames fractures any stable sense of time. Cinematographer Jeffrey L. Kimball's lighting creates constant flickers between shadow and overexposure, staging each environment as a borderland. These choices just don't decorate the story. They resemble the instructions of the Tibetan book by dislodging you from ordinary perception and reminding you that you are caught in an intermediate state. As in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the breakthrough comes when Jacob stops resisting. When he finally lets go of his attachments, his guilt, his fear, and his grief, the distortions lose their menace, and the path toward release opens. The same landscape that once held monsters shifts into a path, and guiding figures like Gabe come forward as his escorts. At the same time, the movie refuses to erase worldly explanations. Its closing caption bluntly states that Jacob's unit was exposed in Vietnam to BZ, a hallucinogenic compound tested by the military. This stark reference anchors the horror in experimental trauma and government betrayal. Taken together, the film operates on double registers: a mystical initiation rite and a political tragedy about soldiers discarded by their country. Rubin builds the ambiguity into the text. The audience is not forced to pick whether Jacob's visions emerge from toxic drugs or from the bardo. They're asked to notice that both can technically be true at once. That ambiguity sets the stage for another perspective, because even if the film can be read as a guide for the dying, it still unfolds like something else entirely. Not just an afterlife document, but a kind of therapy session in cinematic form. If Jacob is already dead, then why does his journey still resemble the unraveling of a trauma case study? On screen, his symptoms line up with what you might find in a diagnostic manual. He lies awake through sleepless nights, plagued by blurred visions that intrude into waking life. His grip on reality is tenuous, and he carries the crushing weight of Vietnam alongside the deeper wound of his child's death. It's no wonder the first wave of critics locked on to PTSD as the lens. That reading fits the surface. A veteran haunted by unspeakable grief stumbling towards collapse. But if you track how those visions actually unfold, they resemble less a chaotic breakdown and more a deliberate progression. Each nightmare scene pushes him into another pocket of unfinished business, almost as if the film is staging therapy in slow, painful installments. It's inside the hospital set pieces that the mystical logic unveils itself. Each stage drags Jacob deeper. Visions of his unraveling marriage, and the unbearable absence of Gabe, and the battlefield itself with comrades bleeding out around him. In one sequence, he leaps from a taxicab only to find himself inexplicably back in his family home, pulled into memories he doesn't want to face. That culminates with Gabe waiting quietly on the staircase, ready to lead him upward. Layered like this, the phantoms observe the pacing of a session. Instead of a therapist's questions prompting confession, apparitions force their way to the front until Jacob has no choice but to look. That rhythm of resistance and surrender mirrors psychological treatment as much as it echoes initiatory rites. It's not a literal counseling session, but it borrows the scaffolding of therapy to stage spiritual purgation. Trauma provides the language, while purgatory supplies the frame. Once read in that light, the film's central strategy becomes much clearer. PTSD symptoms serve as the entry point, recognizable enough to anchor the story in the real devastation of war veterans. The afterlife journey then reshapes that raw material, turning nightmares into ritual stations of purification. The horrors Jacob meets don't function only as plot decoration or jump scares. They labor as exercises in release, dramatizing the inner work required to let the attachments dissolve. So the familiar PTSD reading isn't false so much as partial. What the audience receives is both fused into a story that begins with diagnosis but ends with redemption, which leaves one last and troubling line of thought. If Jacob's terrors are scripted like therapy and staged like myth, then what message is the film pressing into us about the creatures of our own fear? Jacob's Ladder opens as a horror movie but ends as a guidebook, Every loss Jacob refuses to release becomes another rung he has to climb. By the time Gabe takes his hand, we realize that we've been watching less a descent into madness than an ascent toward peace, a purgatorial map disguised as a genre film. That's why Ruben gives us BZ and the conspiracy subplot, but never lets them settle into the question. He wants us living in that in-between state, just like Jacob. Horror gives us the language of fear, but here it hides a strange comfort. The monsters aren't here to destroy him or us. They're here to set us free. Ready to perform another cinematic postmortem on a classic flick? Then be sure to check out my review of Sinister. You'll find a link here on the screen. I hope to see you over there.